In the shadow-draped corners of a sprawling metropolis, the Hathaway Building stood as a grim reminder of the city's less savory history. A towering structure of faded brick and stained windows, it had been many years since Hathaway had seen better days. Now, it served as low-cost housing for those desperate enough to ignore its ominous reputation. Alice, a young college graduate with aspirations of becoming a journalist, was drawn to Hathaway by the allure of cheap rent and the promise of a good story. She moved into apartment 513, a modest one-bedroom unit with peeling wallpaper and creaky floors, but what truly interested her were the stories that seemed embedded in the very walls of the building. From the moment she moved in, Alice felt a chill that never seemed to go away, a constant cold draft that whispered of hidden secrets. Her neighbors were an eclectic mix: old Mrs. Delaney, who had lived in the building since the 1960s, Tom the gruff handyman who knew every inch of the building, and young Mia, a quiet girl who always seemed to be looking over her shoulder. Alice began to document her experiences from day one, her blog entries a mix of personal reflections and interviews with her neighbors. She learned about the Hathaway's sordid past, the site of a tragic fire in the 1920s, a series of unexplained disappearances in the 50s, and countless reports of strange occurrences that had never been satisfactorily explained. But it was the basement that held the darkest stories. Long sealed off from the main floors, it was rumored to be the heart of the building's haunting. Intrigued and undeterred, Alice convinced Tom to let her explore it, promising to mention him in her blog if he would accompany her. The descent into the basement was like stepping into another world. The air grew colder, the silence more oppressive. Old files, furniture, and forgotten relics of past tenants were piled high, casting long shadows in the dim light of their flashlights. As they moved deeper, Tom's usually unflappable demeanor began to falter. He muttered about feeling watched and pointed out areas of the basement where even he refused to go. Suddenly, Mia's voice echoed through the building's old intercom system, frantic and clipped with static. "Alice, come back up now." "Something's happening." The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by a low, humming noise that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Tom, pale and shaken, urged a hasty retreat, but Alice's curiosity had been piqued. Ignoring Tom's protests, she ventured toward a secluded corner of the basement where the hum was loudest. There, hidden beneath a dusty tarp, she discovered an old radio, its lights flickering as though it was struggling to stay on. As she reached out to touch it, the air around her crackled with electricity, and the building shook as if gripped by an unseen force. The walls around them began to groan, and the shadows seemed to swirl and coalesce into the form of a man, his features blurred but his presence unmistakable. Tom grabbed Alice's arm, pulling her away as the radio erupted into a cacophony of voices, screams, pleads for help, and a deep, malevolent laugh that chilled her to the bone. They ran for the stairs, the building seeming to convulse around them, each step upward a battle against an unseen malice that didn't want them to leave. They emerged into the hallway, breathless and terrified. Mia was waiting, her eyes wide with fear. She told them that the building had locked down, every exit sealed and the windows impossible to open. The residents had gathered in the lobby, trapped and terrified, as the haunting that had plagued Hathaway for decades seemed to come to a horrific crescendo. Determined to uncover the truth and hopefully end the nightmare, Alice, Tom, and Mia decided to delve into the building's history, searching for any clue that might tell them why the Hathaway was so haunted and how they might cleanse it of its malevolent presence. Their search led them to old newspaper clippings, interviews with past residents, and a series of letters hidden in the walls during renovations, each piece of the puzzle hinting at a sinister web of rituals, secret societies, and a cursed object said to be buried within the building's foundations. As the night wore on, the disturbances grew more violent and bizarre. Objects flew through the air, spectral figures appeared and vanished at will, and the cries of the damned echoed through the halls. The residents, driven to the brink by fear, looked to Alice and her friends to save them from the encroaching darkness. Just as Alice uncovered a potential link between the haunted radio and the disturbances, a new horror emerged from the basement. The radio had been a beacon, and now something had answered its call. The ground shook, and from the bowels of the earth, a new, more terrifying force began to make itself known. The temperature dropped so suddenly that their breath turned to mist, and a deep, pervasive dread settled over everyone trapped inside. As Alice, Tom, and Mia regrouped with the others in the lobby, they found the residents huddled together, some praying, others simply rocking in silent terror. The building's lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The air was filled with the scent of ozone, and the walls themselves seemed to pulse with a sinister life force. Alice knew they had to act quickly. She pulled Tom and Mia aside, sharing her discovery of the connection between the old radio and the haunting. The device appeared to be an antique known as a spirit box, used in the early 20th century for seances. It seemed that during one such session, something had been invited and that had never left. Determined to find the cursed object believed to be buried within the building's foundation, which might be amplifying the building's paranormal activity, they devised a plan. They would split up, with Tom and some of the braver residents searching the old records for any blueprint that might show hidden areas or renovations, while Alice and Mia would try to communicate with the spirits using the spirit box, hoping to pacify them or at least understand what they wanted. As Tom left with his group, Alice and Mia set up in the center of the lobby. Alice turned on the spirit box, adjusting the frequency as static filled the air. At first, there was nothing but the crackle of white noise, but then, voices began to emerge. They were disjointed, filled with pain and anger, speaking over each other in desperate tones. "We are trapped. Free us. He brought us here." The messages were chilling, and Mia clutched Alice's arm, her face pale. As the voices grew louder, the building shook violently, a deep rumbling that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. The lobby windows shattered, sending glass flying like deadly rain, and the doors warped and twisted, sealing them in even tighter. Back in the basement, Tom's group made a horrifying discovery. Hidden behind a false wall, they found a small, sealed chamber. Inside, amid a collection of bizarre occult artifacts, was an old, leather-bound book and a blackened dagger. The book contained detailed drawings and incantations, and at its center, a disturbing illustration that matched the layout of the Hathaway building, a pentagram, with each point marked by a room in the building. Realizing the significance of their find, Tom grabbed the book and dagger and rushed back to the lobby, hoping that whatever answers the book held could help them end the nightmare. As he ran, the halls of Hathaway seemed to warp around him, the walls stretching and floors buckling as if the building itself was trying to prevent him from reaching his destination. When Tom arrived back at the lobby, out of breath and clutching the book, Alice quickly skimmed through it, her eyes widening with each page turn. The book confirmed that the Hathaway building was constructed as a kind of supernatural prison, designed to contain a powerful entity that had been summoned and then could not be controlled. The pentagram design was a containment symbol, meant to keep the entity locked away. The book also contained a ritual that, if performed correctly, might banish the entity back to wherever it had come from. However, the ritual required the dagger, and it needed to be performed at the heart of the building, the basement from which the disturbances seemed to emanate. As they prepared to head to the basement, the building's disturbances reached a fever pitch. The air turned icy, and spectral figures appeared more solidly, their faces twisted in expressions of rage and sorrow. They seemed to be both drawn to and repelled by the spirit box, which continued to crackle and spit static. Alice, Tom, Mia, and a few others made their way to the basement, the air growing colder with each step down. As they reached the bottom, the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them. The only light came from their flashlights, which flickered intermittently as if struggling against an unseen force. In the center of the basement, right where the old radio had been found, they set up for the ritual. Tom placed the dagger on the ground, while Alice read from the book. The words were in a language she didn't understand, ancient and guttural, but as she spoke them aloud, the air around them began to thrum with power. The shadows in the corners of the basement grew denser, coalescing into a dark, swirling vortex. The voices from the spirit box grew louder, a cacophony of screams and pleadings that made it hard to focus. But Alice continued, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. As she reached the climax of the ritual, a brilliant light exploded from the dagger, enveloping the room in a blinding flash. For a moment, everything was still, the screams and the rumbling ceasing abruptly. The group shielded their eyes, and when the light dimmed, they found themselves standing in a silence so profound it was almost palpable. However, the relief was short-lived. As their eyes adjusted to the dim light, they noticed that the symbols etched into the floor of the basement began to glow ominously, a deep red light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The air grew thick, heavy with a sense of impending doom. The ritual, it seemed, had not banished the entity but had instead awakened it fully. From the center of the glowing pentagram, a crack appeared in the floor, widening and deepening rapidly. A foul smell, like that of decay and sulfur, emanated from the chasm, and a low growl reverberated from within, shaking the very foundations of the Hathaway building. Alice stepped back, her heart pounding as she clutched the ritual book to her chest. The pages had begun to turn on their own, flipping back to a passage that had been overlooked. The ritual was not meant to banish but to bind, and it required a sacrifice to complete. Panic swept through her as she realized the implications. The growl intensified, a sound so terrifying it seemed to claw at their very souls. Tom, grasping the severity of their situation, shouted over the noise, urging everyone to think of a way to seal the crack without a sacrifice. Mia, her eyes wide with fear, suggested they try to reverse the ritual, to perhaps push the entity back enough to seal the pentagram and contain it once again. The group scrambled, searching the book for any clue on how to reverse the process. The building trembled violently, cracks spreading up the walls, dust and debris falling around them. The figures that had haunted the hallways appeared again, this time more defined, their expressions tormented as they seemed to plead with the living to correct the mistake. Working together, Alice and Mia recited the incantations backwards, a desperate attempt to undo what had been done. Tom and a few others began to push heavy objects over the crack, trying to physically block the entity from emerging further. The air was filled with a cacophony of noises, the growls from the depths, the chanting of the ritual, the screams of the spectral figures, and the structural groans of the Hathaway building itself. As the ritual reversed, the red light from the pentagram began to fade, dimming to a dull glow. The crack in the floor started to close slowly, the growls turning into roars of frustration as the entity fought against the containment. Alice's voice wavered, but strengthened by the sight of the closing gap, she pushed on, the ancient words of the ritual flowing faster from her lips. Just as the crack sealed shut, the pentagram exploded in a final burst of light, knocking everyone to the ground. Silence fell once again, heavy and ominous. As they stood, shaken but alive, they realized the immediate danger was over, but the Hathaway building would never be the same. Exhausted and traumatized, the group made their way back to the lobby. The other residents, who had felt the building shake to its core, greeted them with a mixture of relief and awe. Alice, Tom, and Mia shared a look of weary camaraderie, knowing they had barely escaped with their lives and had only managed a temporary solution. The entity was contained, but for how long? And at what cost? The building was significantly damaged, and the psychological scars borne by its inhabitants would take even longer to heal. Moreover, the spirit box continued to crackle softly, a chilling reminder that the connection to the otherworldly had been opened and might never be fully closed. In the days that followed, as they began the process of repair and recovery, Alice continued to document everything. Her blog became a crucial recount of the events, drawing attention from paranormal experts, thrill seekers, and skeptics alike. But amidst the newfound fame, Alice couldn't shake off the dread of the basement's sealed crack and the glowing pentagram. The Hathaway building stood quieter now, its hauntings less frequent but more poignant. The residents spoke in hushed tones, their eyes often drawn to the basement door, which had been firmly locked and barred. But the peace was tenuous, the silence a thin veneer over the lingering terror that seeped through the cracks of the aging brickwork. Alice knew she could not leave the story unfinished, her responsibility to the building and its spectral inhabitants weighing heavily on her. The mystery of the Hathaway building was far from solved, and the horror that lay beneath was merely biding its time, waiting for a chance to rise again. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across the streets, the whisper of the entity's rage echoed in the wind, a promise of darkness yet to come. The air in the Hathaway building had changed, it was thicker, heavier with the echo of the recent horrors. Residents moved cautiously, speaking in whispers, as if afraid to stir the fragile peace that had settled over the complex. Alice felt the weight of their gazes, their unspoken expectations that she, somehow, held the key to their safety. Each step she took through the halls was shadowed by the memories of that night, the sounds and fears etched permanently into her mind. Days turned into weeks, and the building's eerie calm remained unbroken. However, Alice knew better than to trust this apparent tranquility. The entity, though contained, had left its mark. The basement door, heavy with new locks and warnings, stood as a grim reminder of the potential danger lurking just beneath their feet. Occasionally, she would pause by it, listening, half expecting to hear the growl of the entity or the whispers of the damned. Her blog had attracted a variety of attention. Paranormal investigators, curious skeptics, and even a documentary crew had come, each eager to uncover the truth of the Hathaway's haunted reputation. Alice cooperated where she could, sharing her experiences and the evidence collected, but she remained guarded, protective of the residents and the building's fragile peace. One evening, as autumn crept over the city, bringing with it a chill that seeped through even the thickest walls, a new development occurred. Alice received a mysterious package. It contained an old, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and fragile. The note attached was cryptic, only stating, "Understand the past to protect the future." Curiosity piqued, Alice spent the night poring over the journal. It belonged to a previous caretaker of the building from the early 1900s, one who had witnessed the original binding ritual that contained the entity. The entries detailed not just the ritual but a prophecy of sorts, one that spoke of the cycle of the blood moon, a time when the entity's power would peak, capable of breaking its bonds if not resealed. The realization hit Alice like a cold wave. The next blood moon was due in just a few weeks. If the journal was correct, they had little time to prepare for whatever horrors awaited them. She shared her findings with Tom and Mia, and together they decided to delve deeper into the history and lore of the building, hoping to find a way to strengthen the containment spell. Their research led them to the city archives, where they uncovered old blueprints of the building and news clippings about its construction. The Hathaway had been built over the site of an ancient cemetery, and the foundation stones were rumored to have been taken from a dismantled church, notorious for its own dark history. Each piece of information added layers to the story, painting a picture of a building almost destined for darkness. Armed with new knowledge and growing trepidation, Alice, Tom, and Mia began to prepare for the coming blood moon. They enlisted the help of the other residents, forming a makeshift community of guardians. Together, they started to reinforce the physical and mystical defenses of the building, setting up salt lines, protective symbols, and even installing new security measures. As the night of the blood moon approached, the air grew tense with anticipation. The residents gathered in the lobby, some holding candles, others clutching talismans and holy symbols. Alice led them in setting up a ritual circle, using the old caretaker's journal as a guide. They placed the blackened dagger at the center, its blade reflecting the moonlight that filtered through the windows. The clock ticked closer to midnight, and as it did, the temperature dropped sharply. A low rumble echoed through the building, subtle at first but growing louder, more insistent. The walls began to vibrate, and a faint glow emanated from the basement door. It was beginning. Alice started the ritual, reciting the incantations from the journal. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled, knowing the gravity of what they faced. Tom and Mia stood by her side, chanting along, reinforcing the spell with their combined will. Outside, the sky turned a deep, bloody red, casting an ominous glow over the city. Inside, the glow from the basement grew brighter, and the rumbling turned into a roar. The building shook, plaster falling from the ceiling, windows rattling in their frames. The residents clung to each other, fear etching their faces as they watched the ritual unfold. Just as the clock struck midnight, a piercing scream erupted from the basement, a sound so terrifying it threatened to shatter their resolve. The floor beneath them cracked, a brilliant light shooting up from the fissure, enveloping the room in blinding radiance. When the light finally dimmed, they found themselves still standing, the building intact but the air charged with a power they could almost taste. The basement door remained closed, its locks glowing faintly with residual magic, as if sealing in the potent energies that had just been unleashed. The residents, shaken but unharmed, looked around in disbelief, their eyes wide with the realization that they had just skirted the edge of a dark abyss. Alice, breathing heavily from the effort of the ritual, felt the journal still clutched tightly in her hands. It had become warm, almost hot, its pages fluttering as if caught in a non-existent breeze. The words on the pages seemed to shimmer, revealing new lines that she had not noticed before, further instructions or perhaps warnings, obscured until this moment of need. The immediate threat had been abated, but the atmosphere in Hathaway Building remained charged, a lingering sense of something unfinished, something paused rather than ended. The residents slowly disbanded, returning to their apartments with weary steps and backward glances, their trust in the normalcy of their home irreparably shaken. In the days that followed, a heavy fog settled over the city, and with it came an oppressive silence that hung heavily around the Hathaway Building. The residents moved quietly, speaking in hushed tones, as if afraid to stir the fragile peace. But Alice knew better than to believe the calm was anything but temporary. The entity, though bound once more, was far from defeated, and the journal's newly revealed writings hinted at a cycle, a recurring battle that they were now part of. Alice, Tom, and Mia met frequently, poring over the journal and the additional notes that had appeared. These new writings spoke of a guardian, a role apparently destined to oversee the containment of the entity, a role that Alice feared was hers to accept. The journal detailed the responsibilities and risks, including a warning that each blood moon would bring a stronger challenge as the entity gathered strength from forces unknown. Determined to prepare better for the next confrontation, Alice organized meetings with the residents, forming a sort of council that would oversee the safety protocols and ensure everyone was educated on the supernatural history of their building. They set up workshops on protective symbols, emergency response drills, and even invited experts in the paranormal to speak and provide training. As the community grew tighter and more proactive, the eerie incidents within the building did not cease but became more manageable. Doors would still slam shut without wind, cold spots would appear randomly, and every so often, a faint hum could be heard emanating from the sealed basement door. Each event served as a reminder of the ever-present threat lurking just below them. However, it wasn't just the physical occurrences that troubled Alice. Her dreams began to be invaded by visions of the past caretakers of the Hathaway, each sharing their own encounters and battles with the entity. These dreams, vivid and intense, seemed to be both a warning and a guide, providing Alice with a deeper understanding of the entity and the building's dark history. One night, a particularly vivid dream jolted her awake. In it, she saw the Hathaway Building as it was being constructed, the workmen unwittingly setting the foundations on an ancient burial site, disturbing the rest of spirits long forgotten. She saw the first caretaker, a stern-faced man with a heavy burden, as he sealed the entity away with the original ritual. His words echoed in her ears even as she woke, "Beware the roots of the Hathaway, for they delve deeper than stone and brick." Shaken, Alice began to investigate the physical foundations of the building. Her research led her to city archives, where she unearthed old maps that showed the building's location had once been a site of historical significance, possibly a sacred ground used by indigenous people, explaining the persistent spiritual disturbances. With each discovery, the pieces of the puzzle slowly fit together, revealing a complex tapestry of history, sacrifice, and supernatural guardianship. Alice documented everything, sharing her findings with the resident council, preparing them for the fact that their roles as temporary guardians of the Hathaway might extend beyond mere ritual and into deeper spiritual commitments. As the anniversary of her moving into Hathaway approached, Alice felt a mix of dread and determination. The next blood moon was due, and with it, another confrontation was inevitable. The building, with its new fortifications and the collective resolve of its inhabitants, felt more like a fortress than an apartment complex, but the enemy they faced was unlike any other, a force that challenged not just their safety but their sanity. On the eve of the blood moon, Alice walked through the quiet halls of Hathaway, her steps echoing softly. The building seemed to breathe around her, a slow, heavy breath of anticipation. She checked the locks on the basement door, tracing the sigils that had been freshly painted around its frame. The air felt electric, charged with an energy that tingled against her skin. As midnight approached, she joined the other residents in the lobby, forming the now familiar ritual circle. The candles were lit, their flames flickering in the still air, casting long shadows across the worried faces of her friends and neighbors. Alice opened the journal once more, its pages fluttering to the section marked for the blood moon ritual. Her voice, firm yet tinged with an underlying tremor of fear, began to recite the ancient incantations, the words weaving through the air, settling heavily around the gathered residents. Outside, the sky turned a deep, menacing shade of red, the blood moon rising ominously above the city, its light seeping through the windows and bathing everything in a sinister hue. A gust of wind rattled the windows, and a distant thunder rolled, a forewarning of the supernatural storm that was about to unfold. As the ritual progressed, the air inside the Hathaway building grew colder, a chill that seeped into their bones. The candles flickered violently as if struggling against an unseen force, casting erratic shadows against the walls. The residents huddled closer, their faces marked by fear but also by a determination born of their previous encounters. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled, a subtle vibration at first that grew into a pronounced shake, causing the chandelier above to sway dangerously. A low hum filled the air, emanating from the direction of the basement, growing louder, more demanding. The sealed door vibrated as if something from within was trying to break free. Alice's voice wavered but regained strength, pushing through the growing cacophony. The words of the ritual seemed to resonate with the building itself, the walls pulsing rhythmically with the hum, as if the structure of Hathaway was responding to the incantations, aiding in their defense. The hum turned into a howl, a sound so harrowing it seemed to claw at the very fabric of reality. Shadows danced frenetically around the edges of the room, coalescing into vague, human-like forms at the periphery of their vision. The residents clutched each other's hands, their collective grip a lifeline against the darkness encroaching on their circle. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the howling ceased. The building shuddered, a final convulsive tremor, and then stilled. The candles flickered one last time before steadying. A profound silence enveloped the room, broken only by the collective sighs of relief from the residents. They had withstood the onslaught, the ritual had held, the entity was kept at bay, its wrath contained once more beneath the foundations of the Hathaway building. But the victory was tempered by the knowledge that this was but a temporary reprieve. The journal, now lying open on the floor where Alice had dropped it during the ritual, fluttered its pages as if caught in a non-existent breeze. It settled on a page they had not noticed before, filled with a prophecy foretelling the eventual return of the entity, stronger and more malevolent than before. The residents of Hathaway, their faces pale under the light of the blood moon, turned towards Alice, their eyes reflecting a mix of gratitude and the dawning realization of their eternal role as guardians against a darkness that would return. They were bound to the building, not just by lease and law but by a duty that transcended the ordinary. Alice picked up the journal, her fingers tracing the ominous words of the prophecy. The weight of her responsibility as the guardian of Hathaway felt heavier than ever. She looked around at her fellow residents, their faces marked by fatigue, fear, but also a newfound resolve. As the blood moon cast its crimson light through the windows, bathing the lobby in its ghostly glow, the silence was a solemn reminder of the battles to come. They were custodians of a dark secret, warriors against a spectral threat that was bound to the very walls of their home. And as the night gave way to the first light of dawn, the Hathaway building stood silent on the horizon, its outline a stark silhouette against the waking sky. Inside, its residents were already preparing for the next confrontation, the next blood moon. Their lives had irrevocably changed. They were no longer just neighbors. They were comrades in arms, bound by fate to the haunted halls of Hathaway, ever vigilant, ever waiting for the darkness to rise again.